There is a word that appears nowhere in the original Hebrew Bible. Not once. Not in Genesis, not in Leviticus, not in any of the prophets, not in the Psalms or the wisdom literature or the legal codes. The word does not exist in the original language of the text that billions of people have used for centuries to define, condemn, celebrate, debate, and legislate human sexuality. That word is homosexuality. The word homosexuality was invented in 1869 by a Hungarian journalist named Karl Maria Kurt-Benny, who coined it in a pamphlet arguing against the Prussian anti-sodomy laws. It is a 19th century neologism, a word that did not exist in any language before the modern period, that describes a concept, a stable sexual identity defined by attraction to people of the same sex, that ancient peoples did not have and ancient texts did not address. And yet the Bible has been read for the past century and a half as if it speaks directly and clearly about this thing that its original writers had no word for and no concept of. As if the ancient Hebrew priests and the first century Greek writers were addressing the same question that is being argued about in 21st century legislatures and church councils and family dinner tables. They were not. They were addressing something. The texts are real, the prohibitions are real, the stories are real, but what they were addressing, what they actually meant in their original historical and cultural context, is considerably more complex, more contested, and more interesting than either side of the modern debate usually acknowledges. This is not a video that will tell you what to believe about homosexuality. It is a video about what the Bible actually says, what it does not say, what it meant when it was written, and how those ancient texts came to carry the weight of a debate their authors could not have imagined. It is a video about the history of an interpretation, which is always more interesting and more important than the interpretation itself. Welcome to this channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand what the Bible says about same-sex behavior, you first need to understand how ancient peoples understood human sexuality, because without that context, you are reading a foreign language text with a modern dictionary and getting a translation that is accurate word by word and completely wrong in meaning. The ancient world did not organize human sexuality around the concept of orientation. The modern understanding of sexual identity, the idea that people are fundamentally heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual as a stable characteristic of who they are, is a specifically modern construction. The historian Michel Foucault, in his landmark 3-volume History of Sexuality, argued that the category of the homosexual as a type of person, as an identity, did not exist before the 19th century. Before that, there were acts, there were behaviors, there were desires, but there was no concept of a person whose fundamental identity was defined by the direction of those desires. The ancient Greeks and Romans organized sexuality around a completely different axis: active and passive, penetrating and penetrated, dominant and submissive. In this framework, a free-born adult male citizen who took the active penetrating role in a sexual act with another male was not violating social norms in the way that a free-born adult male who took the passive role was. The violation was not about the sex of the partner, it was about the social role. A man who allowed himself to be penetrated was seen as having degraded himself to the status of a woman or a slave, the categories of people for whom passivity was socially appropriate. This is completely different from the modern understanding of homosexuality, and it is the cultural world within which the New Testament was written. The Hebrew Bible was written in a different cultural world again, one in which the primary frameworks for understanding sexuality were purity and procreation, covenantal faithfulness and idolatry, the boundaries between Israel and the nations. Understanding the Hebrew Bible's treatment of same-sex behavior requires understanding these frameworks, not imposing the modern framework of sexual identity onto texts that had no such concept. Let us start at the beginning, literally. Genesis 1 and 2, the creation narratives are frequently cited in discussions of biblical sexuality because they establish what the tradition understands as the baseline design of human sexuality: male and female, created for each other, becoming one flesh, The evangelical and Catholic traditions read these texts as establishing a normative pattern for human sexuality that is heterosexual and monogamous and procreative. The interpretive question is whether Genesis is establishing a norm, saying this is how it must be, or describing a paradigm, saying this is one central and beautiful form of human relationship, without excluding other forms. The texts do not resolve this question explicitly. They describe, the description has been read as prescription by most of the tradition. Whether that reading is the only defensible reading is one of the central questions in contemporary biblical scholarship on sexuality. The first text that explicitly addresses same sex behavior is the story of Sodom in Genesis 19. This is the story that gave the English language the word sodomy, and it is the story that has been most frequently cited in Christian tradition as the biblical condemnation of homosexuality. But the story of Sodom, when you read it carefully in its ancient context and in light of how other biblical texts interpret it, is almost certainly not primarily about homosexuality in the modern sense. The story: two angels come to Sodom in human form. Abraham's nephew Lot welcomes them into his house. The men of Sodom, all of them, surround the house and demand that Lot bring out his guests so that they can know them. The Hebrew word yada, which can mean no in the sense of sexual intercourse, but also simply means no in the majority of its uses in the Hebrew Bible. Lot refuses and offers his daughters instead. The angels strike the men of Sodom with blindness. The city is destroyed. The traditional interpretation of this story as a condemnation of homosexuality rests on reading yada as sexual knowledge and understanding the intended sexual act as representative of the sin of Sodom. But multiple problems arise with this reading. First, the sin of Sodom, as interpreted by other biblical texts, has almost nothing to do with same sex behavior. The prophet Ezekiel in chapter 16 is the most explicit. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me, therefore I removed them. The sins listed are pride, gluttony, complacency, and failure to help the poor. Homosexuality is not mentioned. The book of Isaiah condemns Sodom for injustice and oppression. The book of Jeremiah condemns Sodom for adultery and false prophecy. The New Testament letter of Jude mentions Sodom in a context that scholars debate, but that is focused on sexual immorality in general terms and on going after strange flesh, a phrase whose meaning is disputed. Second, the story itself is clearly about gang rape, not about consensual same-sex relationships. The entire male population of the city surrounding a house and demanding access to guests who had been given the protection of hospitality is a story about collective violence and the violation of the sacred obligation of hospitality, one of the most serious moral codes of the ancient Near Eastern world. The sexual element is an expression of the violence and the dominance, not the primary category of the sin. Third, an identical story appears in Judges 19, where the victim is a woman rather than male angels. A Levite and his concubine are given hospitality in Gibeah. The men of the city surround the house and demand the Levite be brought out so they can know him. The host offers his daughter and the Levite's concubine instead. The concubine is gang raped and dies. The story is structurally identical to the Sodom narrative. Nobody reads Judges 19 as a condemnation of heterosexuality. The sexual violence in both stories is the condemnation, not the sex of the intended victim. The scholar Michael Carden, in his extensive study of the Sodom story in its reception history, has documented how the reading of Sodom as primarily about homosexuality was a relatively late development in the tradition, becoming dominant in certain strands of Christian interpretation in the medieval period and not the primary reading in the earlier Jewish or patristic sources. The texts in the Hebrew Bible that most directly address same-sex behavior are in Leviticus, specifically 18:22 and 20:13. Leviticus 18:22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." Leviticus 20:13 says, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them." These are the clearest prohibitions in the Hebrew Bible. They are real. They are explicit. Um, they use the word tova, which is translated as abomination, a word that carries strong moral and ritual weight in the Hebrew tradition. And they have been understood by the mainstream Jewish and Christian traditions as prohibiting male same-sex intercourse. But here is where the interpretive complexity begins. The word toeva, abomination, appears frequently in the Hebrew Bible, and it is applied to a wide range of behaviors that modern Christians and Jews do not universally treat as absolute moral prohibitions. Eating shellfish is called tova in Leviticus 11. Eating pork is tova. A woman remarrying her first husband after divorcing a second husband is tova in Deuteronomy. Offering a blemished animal in sacrifice is tova. Charging interest on loans to fellow Israelites is tova. These are not treated by most modern readers of the Bible as carrying the same moral weight as the prohibition in Leviticus 18:22. The question this raises is not whether the prohibition is in the text. It is. The question is what kind of prohibition it is. The Hebrew Bible distinguishes between different categories of law. There are moral laws that reflect the character of God and the fundamental structure of human flourishing. There are civil laws that govern the political life of ancient Israel. And there are purity and holiness laws that defined the boundaries of the covenant community and its distinctiveness from surrounding nations. The Leviticus prohibitions appear in the Holiness Code, a section of Leviticus specifically concerned with purity and distinctiveness, with marking the boundaries between Israel and the surrounding Canaanite and Egyptian cultures. The scholar Jacob Milgrom of the University of California, Berkeley, one of the greatest Leviticus scholars of the 20th century, spent decades arguing that the Levitical purity laws were specifically addressed to the Israelite community in its covenant context and were not intended as universal moral laws applicable to all humanity in all times and places. His reading is contested. But it reflects a genuine and long-standing question in biblical hermeneutics about how to apply the laws of the Holiness Code to contexts far removed from ancient Israel. The interpretive tradition within Judaism has generally maintained the prohibition while applying it within a framework of halakhic reasoning that is considerably more nuanced than a simple reading of the text suggests. The interpretive tradition within Christianity has been divided between those who read the Levitical prohibitions as enduring moral laws that apply universally, and those who read them as part of the ceremonial law that was superseded by the new covenant. This distinction is important because it is the same distinction applied to other Levitical regulations. Christian theologians who eat shrimp and wear mixed fabric clothing and do not observe the Sabbath as prescribed in Leviticus have already decided, implicitly or explicitly, that at least some of the regulations in the Holiness Code do not apply to them in their original form. The question is whether the prohibition in Leviticus 18:22 belongs to the category of regulations that remain binding or the category that does not. Now we move to the New Testament, where the texts most relevant to the contemporary debate are in the letters of Paul, specifically Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, and 1 Timothy 1. Romans 1 is the most extended and most theologically complex treatment of same-sex behavior in the New Testament. Paul describes a sequence of events. Human beings, despite knowing God from the evidence of creation, exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And then their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. This is the only text in the New Testament that addresses female same-sex behavior, and it is set in a specific theological context, the argument about idolatry. Paul is describing same-sex behavior as a consequence of idolatry, as part of the moral disorder that results from the human rejection of God. He is not, most scholars agree, making an independent argument about homosexuality. He is using same-sex behavior as an example of the disordering of creation that results from the worship of created things instead of the creator. The word Paul uses for contrary to nature, parakousin in Greek, is an important phrase that has been interpreted in multiple ways. The Stoic philosophical tradition from which Paul was borrowing the language used parakousin to describe behavior that violated the natural order, but what the Stoics meant by natural was not what modern readers typically mean. For the Stoics, natural behavior was behavior in accordance with reason and with the design of the cosmos. And the natural order they had in mind for sexuality was shaped by the same active-passive framework we discussed earlier, not by the concept of sexual orientation. The scholar Dale Martin of Yale University, in his careful analysis of this passage, has argued that when Paul uses the language of natural and unnatural, he is drawing on a Stoic philosophical framework that has no concept of sexual orientation and is making a different argument than the one his modern readers assume. There is also a question about what population Paul was describing in Romans 1. He describes people who had known God and turned away, people consumed with passion in the context of idolatrous practice. Some scholars, including the New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson of Emory University, have argued that Paul was describing the specific context of Greco-Roman religious practices associated with certain cults where sexual acts were part of the ritual, rather than making a general statement about same-sex relationships in all contexts. The two words in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1 that are translated as relating to homosexuality in most modern English Bibles are malakoi and arsenokoitai. Malakoi literally means soft ones and was used in Greek to describe a range of behaviors including effeminacy, moral weakness, and being sexually passive. Arsenokoitai is a word that appears extremely rarely in ancient literature and whose exact meaning is debated. It appears to be a compound of the Greek words for male and bed, and may have been coined by Paul himself, possibly drawing on the Greek translation of the Leviticus prohibition. What exactly it meant in practice, what specific behaviors it covered, is not clear from the available evidence. The translation of these words in modern English Bibles has shifted significantly over time. The King James Bible of 1611 translated them as effeminate and abusers of themselves with mankind. The Revised Standard Version of 1946 introduced the translation homosexuals for arsenokoitai, the first time that modern word appeared in an English Bible translation. Many scholars have argued that this translation was anachronistic and misleading, importing a modern concept into an ancient text. The contemporary debate about what these words actually meant in their original context has not been resolved. Here is something that deserves more attention than it usually receives in popular discussions of this topic. The entire New Testament contains no record of Jesus saying anything about same-sex behavior. Not one word. In a gospel tradition that records Jesus' teachings on prayer, fasting, almsgiving, marriage, divorce, wealth, poverty, the law, the prophets, the temple, the kingdom of God, the nature of God, the nature of humanity, and dozens of other topics in extensive detail, same-sex behavior receives no recorded comment from him at all. This silence has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some argue it reflects Jesus' endorsement of the prevailing Jewish prohibition, his silence meaning assent to the tradition he had inherited. Others argue it reflects the relative rarity of the issue in first-century Galilean Jewish society, a world quite different from the urban Greco-Roman context where Paul was writing. Others argue it is theologically significant that Jesus, who repeatedly challenged the conventional moral priorities of his contemporaries, chose not to address this topic. What it does not do is provide the clear, direct, unambiguous teaching on the subject that both sides of the contemporary debate would find most convenient. The history of how these texts have been interpreted is as important as the texts themselves, and it is a history that complicates any claim to a simple, unchanging traditional view. The early church fathers were deeply shaped by the sexual ethics of Greco-Roman Stoic philosophy, as well as by the Hebrew scriptures, and their treatments of sexuality were often more focused on the dangers of passion and pleasure in general than on same-sex behavior specifically. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd century, condemned same-sex behavior in the context of a broader argument against any sexual act oriented toward pleasure rather than procreation. John Chrysostom, writing in the 4th century, preached extensively against what he understood as the sexual excess of the Greco-Roman world, including same-sex behavior in terms drawn as much from Stoic philosophical categories as from biblical texts. The medieval synthesis, associated primarily with Thomas Aquinas, developed the concept of natural law as the framework for sexual ethics. In the Thomistic framework, the natural purpose of sexuality is procreation, and any sexual act that cannot result in procreation is contrary to natural law. This framework condemns not only same-sex behavior, but also contraception, masturbation, and any sexual act between married heterosexual partners that is not potentially procreative. The modern Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality is still substantially shaped by this natural law framework. The Protestant Reformation did not change the traditional condemnation of same-sex behavior. Luther and Calvin maintained the prohibition, drawing primarily on the Genesis creation narrative and the Pauline texts. The Reformed tradition's emphasis on Scripture as the sole authority did not produce a different conclusion on this question, at least not in the 16th century. The significant shift in Christian interpretation of the biblical texts on same-sex behavior began in the late 20th century, driven by a combination of factors: the development of gay and lesbian theology as an academic discipline, the increasing social visibility and acceptance of LGBTQ people in Western societies, the influence of historical critical biblical scholarship that raised questions about the original meaning of the relevant texts, and the testimony of gay and lesbian Christians whose experience of their own sexuality did not fit the categories of the traditional interpretation. Scholars like John Boswell of Yale University, whose 1,980 book Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality argued that the early church was considerably more accepting of same-sex relationships than the later tradition acknowledged, and whose 1,994 book Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe documented what he claimed were medieval church ceremonies blessing same-sex unions, opened questions that the tradition had not previously considered answerable. Boswell's work has been extensively criticized and partially discredited on specific historical claims, but it opened a conversation that has not closed. The scholar William Loader of Murdoch University in Australia, who has produced the most extensive scholarly treatment of sexuality in the New Testament and its Jewish background, concludes after exhaustive analysis that the New Testament writers, including Paul, were opposed to same-sex behavior in all its forms, that this opposition was grounded in their understanding of the creation narratives, and that attempts to find a more affirming position in the New Testament texts themselves are not historically defensible. Loader is himself not opposed to the affirmation of same-sex relationships in contemporary Christianity, but he insists that the case for that affirmation has to be made on grounds other than a claim that the New Testament actually supports it. This is an important and honest scholarly position. The debate about what the Bible says and the debate about what Christians should do in the 21st century are related but not identical. And conflating them, pretending that the exegetical question and the ethical question have the same answer, distorts both. Here is where all of this leads. The Bible addresses same-sex behavior in a small number of texts. Those texts are real, they are in the canon, and they have been understood by the mainstream tradition as prohibitions for most of the history of Judaism and Christianity. That is the honest historical assessment. The Bible addresses same-sex behavior in texts that were written in cultural contexts so different from the modern world that applying them to contemporary questions of sexual identity and same-sex relationships requires a series of interpretive moves whose legitimacy is genuinely contested. The people who make those moves are not all doing so in bad faith. Some of them are doing careful, rigorous, historically informed exegetical work. That is also the honest assessment. The Bible does not contain the word homosexuality. It does not contain the concept of sexual orientation. It does not address the question of whether two people of the same sex who love each other and are committed to each other and are raising children together and are trying to live faithfully are doing something that God approves of or condemns? That specific question, in that specific form, is a modern question. And the Bible is an ancient text. What you do with that gap between the ancient text and the modern question is a theological and ethical decision, not a purely exegetical one. And the communities of faith that are making that decision in different ways, the traditions that maintain the historic prohibition, and the traditions that have moved toward affirmation are not simply divided between those who take the Bible seriously and those who do not. They are divided about how to take the Bible seriously in a world its authors could not have imagined. That is a harder conversation than either side usually acknowledges. It is also a more honest one. Here is the question I want to leave you with, the one that cuts underneath the political and theological debate to the thing that actually matters. When the ancient writers of the text that became the Bible addressed human sexuality, what were they trying to protect? What was the underlying concern, the deepest value that the specific prohibitions were serving? Was it the covenant community's distinctiveness from surrounding cultures? Was it the protection of the vulnerable from exploitation? Was it a vision of human flourishing rooted in faithful, loving, lifelong commitment? Was it the procreative design of human sexuality as a participation in creation? Because if you can identify what the texts were trying to protect, you can ask whether the specific prohibitions are the only or the best way to protect that value in a world those writers could not have imagined. And that question, more than any argument about the precise meaning of arsenokoitai or the exact nature of the sin of Sodom, is the question that the communities of faith wrestling with these issues actually need to answer. What were they protecting, and are we protecting it?